What if I told you that the real prize in Trump's trade war isn't tariffs, isn't immigration, and isn't even about fentanyl? While the media circus focuses on border theatrics, there's a quiet scramble happening beneath the surface, a scramble for lithium, the white gold that powers everything from your smartphone to the electric vehicle revolution. Trump himself has now openly admitted what many suspected. There's been a secret push to secure Mexico's vast lithium reserves, and the implications are staggering. We're witnessing a fundamental shift in how great powers conduct resource extraction in the 21st century, not through outright invasion, but through economic leverage, political pressure, and carefully orchestrated destabilization. Meanwhile, Supreme Court Justice Alito finds himself in the crosshairs for comments that have sparked constitutional fury, and Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum isn't backing down. She's responding with a clarity and force that signals something profound. The era of Latin American compliance with Washington's demands may be ending. This isn't just another news cycle. This is about who controls the resources that will define the next century and whether sovereign nations can resist the new imperialism, dressed in the language of trade deals and national security. Let's start by examining what Trump actually said, because his words matter far more than most people realize. In a recent statement that barely made a ripple in the mainstream press, and isn't that telling in itself, Trump acknowledged that there have been behind-the-scenes efforts to gain access to Mexico's lithium deposits. Now, he framed this as a matter of American energy independence and national security, which is the standard packaging for what is essentially resource acquisition by any means necessary. But here's what makes this admission so significant. Lithium isn't just another commodity. It's the foundational element for the battery technology that underpins the entire green energy transition that Western governments have been promoting for the past decade. Without lithium, there are no electric vehicles at scale. Without lithium, there's no grid-level energy storage to make wind and solar viable as baseload power. Without lithium, the entire technological infrastructure that's supposed to replace fossil fuels simply cannot exist. And Mexico, it turns out, has some of the largest lithium reserves on the planet, particularly in the northern states of Sonora and Chihuahua. Now let's think about the timing of all this. Trump's tariff threats against Mexico, his renewed focus on border security, his complaints about fentanyl flows, all of this creates a pressure campaign that operates on multiple levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's about immigration and drugs, issues that resonate powerfully with his political base. But underneath, there's an economic and strategic dimension that has very little to do with border walls and everything to do with securing access to critical resources. This is how modern empire operates. You don't send in the Marines anymore, at least not as a first resort. You create economic conditions that make it impossible for a country to say no. You leverage debt, trade dependencies, and the threat of financial isolation. You use sanctions, tariffs, and the petrodollar system to bend nations to your will. And if a country still refuses to comply, well, then you have other tools in the toolkit: regime change operations, color revolutions, support for opposition movements, all dressed up in the language of democracy and human rights. Mexico's decision to nationalize its lithium industry in 2022 was a direct challenge to this system. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, pushed through legislation that declared lithium a strategic national resource and created a state-owned company to oversee its extraction and commercialization. This was a bold move, one that echoed the resource nationalism of an earlier era. Think of Iran nationalizing its oil in 1951, or various Latin American countries taking control of their copper, tin, and other mineral wealth in the 1960s and 70s. And we know how those stories ended, don't we? Coups, interventions, economic warfare, and the installation of compliant governments that would reverse those nationalizations and open the doors to foreign corporations once again. The playbook is well established, and anyone paying attention to history knows exactly what happens when a country in America's backyard decides to assert sovereignty over resources that Washington considers essential to its interests. Now enter Claudia Sheinbaum, who took office as Mexico's president in October 2024, succeeding AMLO and inheriting both his political legacy and his confrontational stance toward foreign resource extraction. Sheinbaum is no political novice. She's a scientist by training, holds a PhD in energy engineering, and has been deeply involved in climate and energy policy for decades. She understands exactly what lithium represents in the global economy, and she understands that Mexico's leverage in this situation is considerable. Her response to Trump's admission and to the broader pressure campaign has been measured but firm. She's made it clear that Mexico's lithium will be developed according to Mexican priorities, for Mexican benefit, and that the days of foreign companies extracting wealth from Mexican soil while leaving poverty and environmental destruction in their wake are over. This is a profound shift in the power dynamics between the United States and its southern neighbor, and it's happening at precisely the moment when the global order is fragmenting and the unipolar dominance that the United States has enjoyed since the end of the Cold War is eroding. But let's zoom out for a moment and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just about Mexico and lithium. This is about a fundamental restructuring of global economic relationships that's been accelerating over the past few years. Countries across the global south are watching what's happening with BRICS expansion, with de-dollarization efforts, with China's Belt and Road Initiative, and they're realizing that there are alternatives to the Washington consensus that has governed international economic relations for the past several decades. They're seeing that countries can say no to the IMF's structural adjustment programs, can reject the demands of Western corporations, can build economic relationships with other powers, and can survive and even thrive. This is terrifying to the established order because the entire system depends on compliance. It depends on countries accepting that there is no alternative, that they must open their markets, privatize their resources, and submit to the dictates of international finance capital or face isolation and ruin. Now let's talk about Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito, because his role in this story is both bizarre and revealing. Alito recently came under intense criticism for comments he made regarding Mexico and what he characterized as the country's obligations to the United States. The exact phrasing matters here, and I want to be careful not to misrepresent what he said, but the essence of his remarks suggested that Mexico has a duty to cooperate with American security and economic interests, particularly regarding border issues and, implicitly, resource access. The backlash was immediate and fierce, with constitutional scholars pointing out that a sitting Supreme Court justice has no business making pronouncements about foreign policy, let alone suggesting that a sovereign nation has obligations to the United States beyond what's established in formal treaties and agreements. But here's what's interesting. Alito's comments reflect a mindset that's pervasive among the American elite, a mindset that views Latin America not as a collection of sovereign nations with their own interests and rights, but as an extension of the American sphere of influence where Washington's preferences should naturally take precedence. This is the mentality of empire, and it persists regardless of which political party holds power. Democrats and Republicans might disagree on tactics, on messaging, on which human rights violations to condemn and which to ignore. But there's a bipartisan consensus on the fundamental question of American preeminence and the right to access resources wherever they may be found. Alito's error wasn't in believing these things. Many of his colleagues on the bench and in government believe exactly the same things. His error was in saying the quiet part out loud, in making explicit what's usually kept implicit in the polite language of diplomacy and national security discourse. And Claudia Sheinbaum's response was perfect in its directness. She didn't engage in diplomatic niceties or pretend to be confused about what Alito was suggesting. She simply stated that Mexico is a sovereign nation, that its resources belong to its people, and that no foreign official, whether from the executive, legislative, or judicial branch, has any authority to dictate Mexican policy. This kind of clarity is refreshing and desperately needed in international relations, where obfuscation and deliberate ambiguity have become the norm. But it's also dangerous for the person or country offering it, because clarity removes the plausible deniability that allows powerful nations to exert pressure while claiming to respect sovereignty. When you call out the game explicitly, when you name what's happening, you force a confrontation that might otherwise have remained in the shadows. And confrontations with the United States, particularly over resource access, have historically not ended well for the countries involved. But here's the crucial difference. Mexico in 2025 is not Guatemala in 1954 or Chile in 1973. Mexico has a population of 130 million people, a GDP of over $1.4 trillion, and deep economic integration with the United States through NAFTA and its successor agreement, the USMCA. Any attempt at destabilization would have profound blowback effects on the American economy, particularly in border states and in industries that depend on Mexican manufacturing and labor. Moreover, Mexico is not isolated. It has been building stronger relationships with China, with other Latin American nations, and with the BRICS countries. These relationships provide alternatives, options that didn't exist in previous eras when countries faced a stark choice between submission to Washington or economic strangulation. China, in particular, has been heavily investing in lithium extraction and processing technology and would be more than happy to partner with Mexico on developing its reserves under terms far more favorable to Mexican sovereignty than anything Washington would offer. This is the new reality of multipolarity, and it fundamentally changes the calculations that countries make when facing pressure from traditional hegemons. You can see this same dynamic playing out in Africa, where countries are increasingly rejecting French neocolonialism and turning to Russia and China as alternative partners. You can see it in the Middle East, where Saudi Arabia and the UAE are diversifying their relationships and no longer automatically defer to American preferences. You can see it in Southeast Asia, where ASEAN countries are carefully balancing between the United States and China rather than simply choosing sides. The lithium question is particularly important because it sits at the intersection of so many critical issues: energy transition, technological development, economic sovereignty, environmental justice, and great power competition. The Western narrative around green energy has always been problematic because it refuses to confront the resource implications of the proposed transition. Building millions of electric vehicles and massive battery storage facilities requires enormous quantities of lithium, cobalt, copper, nickel, and rare earth elements. These materials have to come from somewhere, and that somewhere is primarily the global south. So what we're really talking about is a continuation of the same extractive relationship that has characterized North-South economic relations for centuries, just with a green veneer painted over it. Instead of extracting oil and coal, we'll extract lithium and cobalt. Instead of leaving behind polluted oil fields, we'll leave behind toxic mining waste and depleted aquifers. The local populations will still be impoverished and exploited, the environmental destruction will still be catastrophic, and the profits will still flow northward to Western corporations and consumers. This is what Mexico is pushing back against, and this is why Sheinbaum's position is so significant. She's essentially saying that if there's going to be a green energy transition, it needs to be just and equitable, and it cannot replicate the colonial patterns of the fossil fuel era. Mexican lithium should benefit Mexican people, should be extracted using Mexican labor with proper environmental safeguards, should be processed in Mexican facilities creating Mexican jobs, and should be sold at fair market prices that reflect its true strategic value. This is a reasonable position, even a conservative one, but it's treated as radical because it challenges the fundamental assumption that resources in the global south exist primarily for the benefit of the global north. And this assumption is so deeply embedded in the Western worldview that most people don't even recognize it as an assumption. It's just the natural order of things, the way the world works, like gravity or the rotation of the Earth. But let's think about what happens if this assumption breaks down, if more and more countries follow Mexico's example and assert real sovereignty over strategic resources. The implications are staggering. The entire model of cheap goods, cheap energy, and endless growth that has sustained Western living standards for the past several decades becomes unsustainable. Prices go up, access becomes uncertain, and the comfortable assumption that the world's resources are available for purchase at reasonable rates evaporates. This is already beginning to happen in various sectors. We saw it with rare earth elements when China briefly threatened export restrictions. We saw it with natural gas when Russia reduced flows to Europe. We're seeing it now with lithium as producing countries realize their leverage and begin to use it. And the response from the West has been predictably hostile. Accusations of economic warfare, threats of sanctions, and increasingly desperate attempts to secure alternative sources or develop substitute technologies. Trump's admission about the secret push for Mexico's lithium needs to be understood in this context. It's not just about one resource or one country. It's about the United States recognizing that its privileged access to global resources is being challenged and attempting to reassert control before the window of opportunity closes. The urgency is real because the geopolitical landscape is shifting rapidly. Every month that passes sees further de-dollarization, further BRICS expansion, further erosion of Western institutional dominance. The world that existed even 5 years ago, where American preferences automatically translated into global policy, is disappearing. And the American elite, both Democrat and Republican, are increasingly aware that they're facing a choice between adapting to a genuinely multipolar world, where they're one power among several, or attempting to use their remaining military and economic leverage to enforce the unipolar system for as long as possible. Everything we're seeing, the escalating tensions with China, the proxy war in Ukraine, the aggressive stance toward Iran, the renewed focus on Latin America, all of it makes sense as part of a broader strategy to prevent the emergence of a multipolar order and maintain American hegemony. But here's the problem: this strategy is failing. It's failing because the rest of the world is no longer willing to accept subordination, because the economic fundamentals don't support continued American dominance, and because the United States has squandered its credibility and soft power through decades of hypocrisy, illegal wars, and the weaponization of the dollar and the international financial system. Countries have learned that holding reserves in dollars makes you vulnerable to confiscation if you displease Washington. They've learned that integrating too deeply with Western financial systems gives those systems leverage over your domestic policy. They've learned that accepting IMF loans means surrendering economic sovereignty. And most importantly, they've learned that there are alternatives, that China and Russia and other powers are willing to engage on more equitable terms. This doesn't mean that China or Russia are benevolent actors operating from purely altruistic motives. They're pursuing their own interests, just as every country does. But their interests at this moment align with providing alternatives to Western dominance, and countries in the global South are taking advantage of that to negotiate better deals and assert more independence. Mexico's lithium policy is a perfect example. By nationalizing the resource and controlling its development, Mexico can negotiate with multiple potential partners, the United States, China, Europe, whoever offers the best terms, rather than being locked into an exploitative relationship with a single hegemon. This is how sovereignty works in practice. It's not about isolation or autarky, it's about having options and being able to choose the path that best serves your national interest. The Alito incident reveals how unprepared the American establishment is for this new reality. The fact that a Supreme Court justice felt comfortable making pronouncements about Mexico's obligations suggests a profound misunderstanding of how the world is changing. There's a generational aspect to this as well. Many of the people in positions of power in the United States came of age during the unipolar moment of the 1990s and early 2000s when American dominance seemed total and permanent. They internalized the idea that the end of history had arrived, that liberal democracy and free market capitalism had won, and that the rest of the world would inevitably converge toward the American model. This was always a delusion, but it was a comforting one, and it's proving very difficult for the establishment to abandon even as reality repeatedly contradicts it. Sheinbaum, by contrast, represents a different generation and a different perspective. She came of age during the neoliberal period in Latin America, witnessing firsthand the devastation caused by structural adjustment programs, privatization, and the opening of markets to foreign capital. She saw what happened to Argentina, to Chile, to Mexico itself during the peso crisis. She understands that the Washington Consensus brought immense wealth to a small elite while impoverishing the majority and stripping nations of their economic sovereignty. Her political project, like AMLO's before her, is fundamentally about reversing that process, about reclaiming sovereignty and building a more equitable economic model. This isn't socialism or communism, despite what some American commentators might claim. It's actually much closer to the kind of economic nationalism that characterized the United States itself during its period of industrial development in the 19th and early 20th centuries, using state power to protect domestic industries, to ensure that resource extraction benefits the nation, and to build national capacity rather than allowing everything to be dictated by short-term market forces and foreign interests. The irony is rich. The United States developed using exactly these policies: high tariffs, infant industry protection, strategic state intervention in the economy, and then, once it had achieved dominance, it turned around and insisted that every other country must embrace free trade and market fundamentalism. This is a classic case of kicking away the ladder, and countries are increasingly recognizing it as such. They're studying the actual history of how countries develop, not the idealized fairy tales promoted by the IMF and World Bank, and they're implementing policies based on what actually works rather than what serves the interests of international capital. Mexico's lithium nationalization fits perfectly into this framework. It's not ideological, it's pragmatic. It's based on the recognition that if Mexico allows foreign companies to extract lithium under the same terms that governed oil extraction for much of the 20th century, the result will be the same: enormous profits for corporations, environmental destruction for local communities, and very little benefit for the nation as a whole. We're at a genuinely historic juncture, one of those moments when the tectonic plates of global power are shifting and the old certainties no longer hold. Trump's admission about pursuing Mexico's lithium is significant because it makes explicit what has usually remained implicit. Alito's comments are significant because they reveal the mentality of an elite that hasn't yet grasped how much the world has changed. And Scheinbaum's response is significant because it demonstrates that countries are no longer willing to simply acquiesce to American demands, regardless of the pressure applied. The outcome of this particular confrontation over Mexican lithium will have ramifications far beyond the immediate issue. If Mexico successfully maintains control over its lithium and develops it according to its own priorities, it will serve as a model for other countries with strategic resources. If the United States manages to force Mexico to open its lithium sector to American companies, it will demonstrate that sovereignty remains largely illusory for countries in the American sphere of influence, and the window for real independence will have closed, at least for the foreseeable future. This is why this story matters. This is why we need to pay attention not just to the surface-level drama of tariffs and border walls, but to the deeper currents of resource competition, sovereignty, and the restructuring of global power. The next few years will determine whether we're moving toward a genuinely multipolar world with space for different development models and real national sovereignty, or whether the existing hegemonic structure will be reinforced through whatever means necessary. And make no mistake, the stakes could not be higher.